The racist and corrupt cops laughed at the black woman dressed like a homeless person inside that courtroom, but what they didn't know was that the woman they humiliated was the chief of the FBI, working undercover. And what happened to those officers after that day, left the whole country speechless. She had walked into that courthouse with slow, deliberate steps, her coat filthy, her shoes cracked, her scent marked by the cold indifference of sleeping on sidewalks. Her presence alone made people uncomfortable. That was the point. Eyes followed her like shadows, expressions twisted into scorn. To them, she was disposable, invisible. Nothing. Just another stray soul stinking up their sterile world of tailored suits and practiced lies. But she wasn't there to beg. She wasn't there to watch. She was there to remember every face. "Hey," one of the officers said, not even hiding the disdain in his voice, "you lost, Grandma." The other leaned in, laughing. "Nah, she's just here to warm up a bit. Let the rats in now, huh?" She didn't flinch. She kept walking, head bowed, hair tangled like vines. But when she reached the third row of wooden benches and quietly sat down, that's when it escalated. One of them pulled a handful of coins from his pocket and tossed them at her feet. "Go pick that up," he said, his voice louder this time, smug, dripping with venom. "Must be worth your lunch." Laughter. Loud, cruel. It echoed off the marble walls like applause in hell. Everyone saw it. The guards. The clerk. The damn judge. No one said a word. That courtroom, with its polished floors and solemn portraits, had turned into a stage. A public execution of dignity. And she was the offering. But not really. What they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, is that this whole show was being recorded. For months, complaints had surfaced, silent whispers from victims who never made the evening news. Stories of planted evidence. Beatings that never happened according to the reports. Trials manipulated before the gavel even dropped. And those officers? The ones laughing now. They were the stars of every single one of those horror stories. But proving it required something no one had dared to do before. Someone had to enter the lion's den as prey, knowing they were the hunter all along. That courtroom wasn't just a hall of law, it was a nest of corruption. The case being judged that day. Another black teen facing a charge that made no sense. A kid whose future was about to be buried by the same system that should have protected him. She had read every line of the police report before she put on that disguise. It reeked of fabrication. But to dismantle the lies, she needed to stand where the lies lived. She had memorized their routines. Studied their language. Analyzed every sarcastic smirk, every arrogant chuckle, every time they called someone, boy, in a tone dipped in contempt. She had spent weeks outside that courthouse, talking to people who'd lost their sons, their brothers, their fathers to those same cops. People too scared to speak up. People tired of being silenced. But she wasn't scared. Not anymore. Not after what they'd done to her nephew. He'd been 15. Wrong place, wrong time. Cuffed. Charged. Forgotten. That was the real reason she was there. They thought she was powerless. That's how deep the rot went. Even when she stood in front of them, even when she stared into their eyes, they saw nothing but a stereotype. And that's what gave her the advantage. They didn't see the badge under the rags. They didn't see the plan unfolding right in front of them. They didn't notice the tiny device taped beneath the bench she sat on. Or the FBI agents waiting in unmarked vans outside. Or the judge's pen camera, already rolling. They thought they were in control. The arrogance of evil is that it never believes it will be caught. So when she stood up in the middle of that courtroom, after all the jokes had been told, after they'd exhausted their creativity in degrading her, and began to speak, the room went silent. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't tremble. It cut through the air like steel. She asked a single question: do you remember every face you've ever stepped on? The officers laughed again. But this time, it was nervous. And when the doors opened, and a wave of suits, cameras, and agents filled the room, reality snapped like a whip. The chief of police turned white. The prosecutor dropped his pen. One of the officers, the one who had tossed the coins, tried to step backward. He didn't get far. Everything was about to change. Because justice wasn't coming. It was already in the room. But what exactly had she uncovered? And how deep did the corruption go? That's what they all wanted to know. And that's what you're about to find out. Because what happened after she took off that disguise shattered every lie that courtroom had ever told. And not a single one of them saw it coming. Before we begin this story, we want to send a clear message to every black viewer watching this: you matter. Your dignity matters. Your story matters. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, discrimination, and injustice. This channel is a safe space for truth, empowerment, and real stories that hit deep. We see you. We respect you. And we're honored to have you here. Now, sit back and get ready for a story that will shake you, in the best way. Don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist and hit that like button if this story moves you. Enjoy the story. The morning sky over Baltimore carried a weight that wasn't just in its gray clouds. The city, with its brick row houses and cracked sidewalks, felt like it was always holding its breath, waiting for something to shift, for someone to break the pattern. It was in this uneasy rhythm that Keisha Robinson lived her duality. To the world, she was invisible. A woman people barely glanced at, often mistaking her for another homeless figure lost in the city's forgotten corners. But that was exactly how she wanted it. Because invisibility gave her power. And power, when rooted in purpose, was more dangerous than any weapon. No one looking at her would imagine she was the newly appointed chief of the FBI's Internal Corruption Division. She had spent the last 19 years in the bureau. Not behind a desk, but in the field, learning the code of silence that governed law enforcement from the inside out. She'd seen the cracks, the whispered favors, the invisible hands exchanging power beneath the surface. And now, after everything, after what they did to her nephew, after what she'd uncovered, this was personal. Keisha wasn't born into privilege. She grew up on the west side of the city, raised by a mother who juggled 2 cleaning jobs and a father who was gone more than he was present. But there was no bitterness in her. Only fire. That same fire had carried her through law school at night, bureau training during the day, and undercover operations that broke her bones but never her spirit. People respected her because she never asked for shortcuts. She earned her place in rooms where people didn't expect her to exist. But even with all her credentials, all her victories, she knew one truth: for a black woman, especially one who didn't bow or bend, respect was never freely given, it had to be taken. And that courtroom she walked into wasn't just a place of justice. It was the epicenter of a system designed to chew up people like her and spit them out. Inside that courthouse worked men like Officer Bradley Kearns and Sergeant Wayne Colton. Kearns had 10 years in the force and a spotless record, on paper. In reality, he was the kind of cop who could smile in front of cameras while slipping cocaine into a kid's backpack out of frame. Colton was worse. He was the one who trained Kearns. Tall, smug, with a history of complaints that somehow always vanished into thin air. The two of them had built careers off of manufactured arrests, twisting facts, using poor, black neighborhoods as hunting grounds. Their reputation wasn't about service, it was about fear. They walked the courthouse like kings. Everyone knew them. Judges greeted them by first name. Prosecutors handed them cases like gifts, never questioning a single line in their reports. And why would they? These were the men who kept the streets clean. In that courtroom, sitting on benches polished by decades of verdicts, sat people like them. Powerful people. Untouchable. That was the reality Keisha had walked into. But she didn't walk in wearing her badge or her authority. She came in layered in anonymity, dirt under her nails, her dreadlocks tangled into knots, her coat 2 sizes too big and stained by the city's indifference. She had to become what they hated. What they mocked. Only then could she see the truth they hid in plain sight. This wasn't about one bad apple. It was about an entire tree with rotting roots. The case being tried that week wasn't unusual. Another teenager, 17, no priors, no weapons found, was being tried for armed robbery. The victim was a local store owner with ties to the department. The only evidence? A grainy camera shot of someone in a hoodie and the testimony of Officer Kearns. Keisha had read the entire file. It was paper thin. If she hadn't stepped in, that boy would be behind bars for a decade, maybe more. And the officers would have walked away high-fiving each other, satisfied they'd scored another win for public safety. But this time, things were different. Keisha wasn't just investigating a wrongful arrest. She was investigating a pattern, a calculated strategy of targeting vulnerable black teens, pinning crimes on them, then burying the truth with clean reports and cooperative witnesses. Her entry into that courtroom wasn't random. She'd spent 3 weeks sleeping near the courthouse, pretending to dig through trash, talking to other homeless individuals who were regularly chased away by court security. She listened more than she spoke. She learned the rhythm of the courthouse, who walked in early, who whispered when no one else was looking. She mapped out blind spots for surveillance, traced exit routes. Every move was strategic. She knew where the judge parked. She knew which bailiff had a drinking problem. She knew the court clerk had a brother doing time. Nothing was accidental. Every second of her appearance that day had been meticulously planned, not for show, but for proof. She needed undeniable evidence, not just assumptions. That meant pushing the officers to reveal their true selves, right there in the house of justice they had corrupted. She was prepared for disrespect. She wasn't prepared for how easily it came. The second she walked in, they locked eyes on her. Not curiosity. Contempt. They didn't see a woman. They saw a nuisance. The dialogue that followed wasn't a slip. It was instinct. "Go pick that up," Kearns had laughed, flipping a quarter toward her boots. "Must be worth your lunch." And Colton followed with a smirk, "Better grab it quick before the rats beat you to it." No one stopped them. Not the judge. Not the clerk. Not the crowd watching. That courtroom, meant to uphold truth, became a theater of humiliation. And Keisha let it play out. Because she wasn't just there for herself. She was there for every single mother who cried over a child locked away for something they didn't do. For every father who stopped believing in the system. For every person who sat in those pews and felt small, invisible, hopeless. That was the mission. Not revenge. Justice. There was one more piece to this puzzle, though. The boy on trial. His name was Andre. 17. Soft-spoken. Eyes like a child still learning how to dream. When Keisha saw him, something cracked inside her. He reminded her of Marcus, her nephew, who never made it home that night. Marcus had also been soft-spoken. Thoughtful. And now, he was a file on a dusty shelf labeled, "Closed Case." Watching Andre sit there, barely understanding the weight of the accusation, Keisha made a promise to herself: this time, they would not win. She wasn't alone in her mission. There were others. Silent allies placed with care. An intern in the DA's office feeding her transcripts. A janitor who positioned the hidden camera. Even a sympathetic officer, Detective Maya Holloway, whose father had once been a victim of the same kind of corruption and who had joined the force to change it from within. They had all risked something to expose this ring. But Keisha was the centerpiece. If she failed, everything collapsed. And failure was not an option. What came next would take nerves of steel. She would sit through that trial, endure more degradation, until the right moment came. The moment where the illusion shattered and the truth screamed louder than their power. But the question lingering in her mind, heavier than the judgment in that room, was simple: would the world believe her once the mask came off? Or would they dismiss her, just like they always dismissed the truth when it came dressed in black skin and dirty clothes? She didn't have that answer yet. But she was ready to find out. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet arrogance that morning, the kind of arrogance that comes from knowing the game is rigged in your favor. Officer Kearns leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, trading smirks with Sergeant Colton as they watched the crowd filter in. Keisha remained in the same seat she had chosen days before, the one near the back, her presence still met with glances of discomfort, but fewer now. Her silence was unnerving to them. People expected the homeless to beg, to talk to themselves, to ask for things. But she asked for nothing. Just sat and watched. That made them curious in the worst way. And curiosity, in people like Kearns and Colton, often turned into cruelty. The trial moved slowly, as expected. Every minute stretched with formalities and procedural delays. Keisha watched as the prosecutor, a clean-shaven man with a rehearsed sincerity, made his case with the help of edited footage and vague witness statements. The evidence was brittle, but presented with such confidence that even the most skeptical juror would second-guess their doubts. When Officer Kearns was called to the stand, his demeanor shifted into something performative. He sat straight, hands folded, and spoke with the trained precision of someone who had done this 100 times before. His voice dripped with authority. The suspect matched the description provided to us during the initial dispatch, he explained, looking directly at the jury, a black male, approximately 6 feet tall, hoodie, dark jeans. When I approached, the suspect fled. That was when I pursued and made the arrest. Keisha watched every twitch in his jaw, every pause between his lies. She knew the report had been written before the arrest was even made. The security footage showed someone with a different build, different shoes, even a different gait. But the officers knew no one would question them. The narrative had been set. A hoodie. A sprint. A threat. And suddenly, a teenager becomes a criminal. Outside the courtroom, the city lived its usual rhythm. Protesters passed occasionally, chanting for justice in older cases, holding signs with names that were starting to blur together in the collective memory. Some knew about the trial happening that day. Most didn't. But inside, a war was being fought. Not just for Andre, the boy accused, but for the right to believe that justice still had a pulse. Keisha had spent years knowing that the system wasn't broken, it was working exactly how it was designed. But still, she wanted to believe there was something salvageable left beneath the decay. She met with Detective Maya Holloway in a cramped utility closet 2 floors below the courtroom during a recess. Maya was nervous, shifting her weight between feet, her badge barely visible beneath her jacket. "The files are ready," she whispered, handing over a flash drive. The judge's financial records, the security footage from the back alley the night of the arrest, and the incident reports from previous arrests made by Kearns and Colton. Keisha took it, her expression unreadable. Maya's voice lowered. "You sure about this? If this goes sideways, they'll bury you. Hell, they'll bury all of us." Keisha nodded slowly, her voice steady. "It's already gone sideways. I'm just trying to bring it back." Back in the courtroom, the defense attorney stood and asked Kearns about inconsistencies in the report. Nothing aggressive. Just enough to plant doubt. Kearns responded with practiced calm, deflecting each point with departmental jargon and references to standard procedure. The jury barely reacted. Keisha watched their faces, most of them white, middle-aged, removed. They weren't reacting to facts. They were reacting to presentation. And Kearns presented well. Later that afternoon, as the court broke for lunch, Keisha remained seated. She watched Colton approach the judge, whisper something, and then exit through the side door reserved for staff. She followed. Not too close, just enough to catch the rhythm of his steps. He stopped outside the break room, speaking in low tones with another officer. Keisha stepped into the hallway just as Colton turned. His eyes met hers. For a second, nothing was said. Then he sneered. Still hanging around, huh? His voice was sharp, louder than it needed to be. You lost or just like the smell of power? Keisha didn't answer. He took a step closer. You know, some of us think you're a plant. Not the homeless type. The kind that thinks she's clever, hiding in plain sight. But let me tell you something, his voice dropped to a whisper, venom curling into every word, clever gets you nowhere if no one believes you. Keisha held his gaze. Then it's a good thing I'm not trying to be clever. Colton blinked. The silence between them was heavy. That evening, after court adjourned, Keisha walked through the city's backstreets. She passed boarded-up shops, streetlights flickering like they couldn't decide whether to live or die. She was thinking about how close they were. About how far they still had to go. Her phone buzzed, a text from the tech team embedded in a van nearby. The files from the flash drive had been verified. The judge had received unregistered payments over the past year, all linked to cases involving the same two officers. The pattern was clear now. They didn't just arrest innocent kids. They funneled them through a courtroom that was rigged from top to bottom. Keisha closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cold night air anchor her. Tomorrow would be the final push. The next morning, the tension in the courtroom was different. Subtle. Like static before a storm. Maya avoided eye contact. The defense attorney seemed more confident. Even Andre's posture had changed, he looked less like a victim and more like someone waiting for something real to happen. Keisha felt it too. This was the day everything would either fall apart or fall into place. When the court clerk called the session to order, a murmur swept the room. Colton wasn't there. Neither was Kearns. The judge looked rattled, flipping through papers with unnecessary force. The prosecutor leaned toward the bench, whispering urgently. Something was wrong. Keisha's heart beat faster, but her face didn't show it. And then the door opened. What happened next changed everything. But before we get there, you need to know one thing, not everyone in that courtroom was who they said they were. And by the time they realized who was who, it was too late. The courtroom felt colder that morning, as if the walls themselves had learned how to shiver. Light filtered in through the high windows, streaking across the polished floor like broken truths. Everyone was seated, but there was an undercurrent of discomfort hanging in the air. Keisha could feel it vibrating in her chest. The judge seemed uneasy, fidgeting with his robe, glancing more often toward the back exit than the case files in front of him. The prosecutor kept looking at his phone, his lips pressed so tight together they looked white. But what really set the tone was the absence of Kearns and Colton. 2 empty seats, 2 silent names, and too many eyes pretending not to notice. Then, just before the proceedings began, the door opened. Kearns walked in with forced composure, his uniform pressed, his face unreadable. Behind him, Colton followed, his expression more guarded, like a man walking into a trap but refusing to show he knew it. They didn't speak to anyone. Didn't glance toward Keisha. They went straight to their assigned seats like ghosts re-entering a world they no longer controlled. That was the moment Keisha knew, they had sensed something. Maybe someone had tipped them off. Maybe their instincts were finally catching up. But it didn't matter. The wheels were already in motion. The walls were already closing in. The judge cleared his throat and called the court to order. His voice cracked slightly, but no one acknowledged it. The prosecution called its final witness, an eyewitness who had supposedly seen Andre running from the scene. The man took the stand and began to recite a testimony that felt memorized. But just as he began describing what Andre was wearing, the defense attorney stood up and interrupted. His voice was calm, but steady. He turned to the judge and said, "Before we continue, Your Honor, we'd like to submit new evidence that directly contradicts this witness's account. The judge hesitated. This is highly irregular, yes. But admissible. And necessary. With a nod from the defense, Maya Holloway stepped into the room carrying a hard drive. She moved toward the projector, connecting it without saying a word. The lights dimmed slightly. The screen blinked to life. And then the video began. The courtroom shifted. People leaned forward. The footage showed the alley behind the convenience store, time-stamped, crystal clear, the original file extracted from the store's internal system. It showed someone leaving the scene. Same hoodie. Same build. But when the figure turned toward the camera, the face wasn't Andre's. It was someone older, broader, with a scar running down the left cheek. Someone who clearly wasn't a teenager. The defense attorney turned to the witness still on the stand. Is that the same person you claim to have seen running? The witness swallowed. I'm not sure. It looks. I don't know. You just testified under oath that you saw the defendant run from that location. But this video shows someone else entirely. Before the judge could intervene, another video began to play. This time it wasn't surveillance footage, it was body cam audio from Officer Kearns. Only the audio. Just enough. It captured his voice, low, aggressive, just before the arrest. Grab the kid in the hoodie. Doesn't matter which one. We've got 5 minutes before they clean the scene. Make it look good. The room froze. Then chaos. Murmurs. Gasps. A juror stood up, covering her mouth. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. But it was already too late. The veil had been lifted. Kearns stood up, his face burning. That audio is manipulated. That's not me. That's AI. Anyone can fake that. But then Keisha rose. She stepped into the aisle, the layers of her disguise still intact, but her voice changed. Clear. Authoritative. No longer trembling, no longer whispering. It's real. And you know it's real. You said those words. Kearns turned, fury replacing fear. Who the hell are you? She walked forward, every eye in the courtroom locked onto her. She reached into her coat and pulled out her badge, gold, sharp, undeniable. She held it high. My name is Keisha Robinson. Chief of the FBI's Internal Corruption Division. And you've just confessed in front of a federal investigation. Silence fell so heavy it almost cracked the floor. Colton lunged forward. This is entrapment. This whole thing is illegal. You can't, you think justice is illegal, she cut him off, her voice like thunder, shaking even the strongest men in that room. You think framing a 17-year-old boy for a crime you never intended to solve is legal? You think bribing judges and disappearing evidence is legal? You've been building your kingdom on the backs of people who couldn't fight back. But guess what, now they can. The doors behind her opened. Agents in suits poured in. No shouting. No drama. Just calm, efficient control. Colton and Kearns backed away, still barking accusations, but no one listened anymore. Handcuffs clicked. Their weapons were removed. Their badges stripped. Keisha turned toward the judge. You'll be investigated, too, she said flatly. We know about the deposits. We know about the dismissals. You let this happen. Over and over. Not because you didn't know, but because you didn't care. He didn't respond. He couldn't. His world was crumbling faster than he could think. Then Keisha faced Andre. The boy had tears in his eyes, not from relief, but from something deeper. Confusion. Gratitude. The kind of disbelief that comes from never imagining someone would fight for you at this level. You're going home, she said gently. You were never the one on trial. They were. As the agents escorted the officers out, the courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence. No applause. No cheers. Just the heavy realization of what had just unfolded. A system that had worn a mask of fairness had just been unmasked. And the woman who exposed it didn't come in with fanfare or weapons. She came in dressed like the people they ignored. And that's what made her invisible. And deadly. But something else was still coming. A name not yet spoken. A connection not yet revealed. Because one of the people in that room, someone still watching from the sidelines, was more involved than anyone suspected. And when that truth came out, even Keisha wouldn't be ready for it. The doors hadn't even fully closed behind Kearns and Colton before the whispers began to build again, not loud but urgent, carrying a weight that couldn't be silenced by a gavel. The courtroom had shifted permanently. What was once a sanctuary of perceived justice was now exposed as a battleground of corruption, betrayal, and cold calculation. Keisha remained standing, her badge still in hand, her eyes scanning every corner of the room. The mission had reached its peak, but her instincts warned her it wasn't over. Not yet. Something was wrong. Something unfinished. And then she saw him, Judge Elwood Pierce, frozen behind the bench, his hands gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. His jaw clenched and unclenched as though he was swallowing fire. That wasn't fear. It was anticipation. Panic. He was calculating his next move, and Keisha could feel it. The agents had just begun clearing the room when Keisha's voice cut through the air again, steady and sharp. She gestured toward the bench, her tone wrapped in quiet accusation. "There's one more name," she said, and the room quieted again. The judge tried to stand, tried to speak, but words caught in his throat like gravel. He reached for his glass of water, took a long sip, and finally forced a smile. "Agent Robinson, I don't think this is the appropriate forum. You think I don't know?" she interrupted, and now her voice was filled with something new, not rage, not triumph, but deep, heavy sorrow. "You thought you were clever, hiding behind procedure and position. But you left a trail. You always do. The payments from shell accounts, the sealed juvenile records you ordered reopened for special circumstances, the cases that should have never seen the inside of this room. You were part of this long before Kearns and Colton got their first promotions. You didn't just allow this. You designed it." A collective intake of breath rippled across the room. The jurors looked at one another, bewildered, as if they had been thrust into a different reality mid-trial. Even Maya looked stunned. This hadn't been in any of the briefings. Keisha had kept this part to herself. It was the final card, the one you don't play until you're sure no one else can move. The judge straightened, and now his voice came back, not shaken, but icy. "This is slander. You're overstepping your jurisdiction." Keisha didn't blink. "Then let's talk jurisdiction. Let's talk about Marcus Robinson. My nephew." A silence fell over the room so complete it seemed to suck the air from everyone's lungs. The judge's lips parted. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then came a weak, measured response. "I don't know what that name has to do with. He was 16, she continued, her voice no longer raised but vibrating with the kind of restrained emotion that made people lean in. "He was arrested for a robbery that never happened. Evidence was fabricated. Witnesses recanted. But the case moved forward. Why? Because it went through your courtroom. You fast-tracked it. Denied appeals. Reduced his defense funding. And when he died in juvenile detention after being assaulted, when his case was reviewed, you sealed it. I followed the law," the judge said, his face now flushed, his tone defensive and brittle. "You think I remember every petty case that crosses my bench? I see hundreds. You remember this one," Keisha said. "You remember it because you received a direct transfer from the same shell corporation that funded the police department's outreach program. You remember it because your signature appears on a document recommending extended sentencing, despite a complete lack of priors. You remember it because I was in your chambers after the sentencing, begging for a second chance. And you looked me in the eye and said, some kids just end up where they belong. The room exploded. This time not with noise, but with energy. Something broke. A collective understanding dawned on everyone at once, like a curtain had been torn down and behind it stood a man not of wisdom, but of wrath. The judge sat down slowly. You can't prove that, he whispered. Keisha stepped forward. I can. We traced the accounts. We matched signatures. We have voice recordings. You were sloppy, Judge. Sloppy because you thought your robe made you untouchable. From the back of the room, an agent approached and whispered into her ear. She nodded slowly, then looked back at the judge. You're under federal investigation. As of this moment, your authority here is suspended. You'll be escorted out and questioned under Section 242 of the Civil Rights Act. He stood then, shaking slightly, trying to hold on to whatever shred of control he believed he had. You've ruined everything, he said, his voice a crackling ember. No, Keisha replied, her eyes meeting his. I revealed everything you already ruined. As agents moved toward him, he didn't resist. He walked stiffly, like a marionette without strings. But as he passed her, he leaned close enough for only her to hear and hissed, you think you've won? This city will forget. They always forget. Keisha didn't flinch. Not this time. When he was gone, the silence that followed felt sacred. Not peaceful. Just, honest. Then Maya came up beside her. Her voice barely held together. Why didn't you tell us about Marcus? Keisha looked at her. Because I needed to make sure this wasn't about revenge. I needed to be sure I was still doing this for the right reasons. And now? Now I know it was always about justice. For him. For Andre. For all of them. Andre's mother had been sitting quietly in the back row. She now came forward, tears streaking her cheeks, and wrapped Keisha in an embrace that neither woman had prepared for. It wasn't polished or performative. It was raw. Real. The weight of everything, fear, hope, grief, transferred in that touch. When the courtroom finally cleared, Keisha stood alone near the bench where it had all unfolded. She looked down at the floor, at the spot where Kearns had once stood laughing. She thought of the coin he tossed. The sound of it hitting the floor. The sound of their laughter. And she smiled, not because she was satisfied, but because the sound had finally stopped. Still, deep in her chest, there was a tremor. Because corruption never sleeps. It hides. It waits. And somewhere in the city, someone else had already started rewriting the next lie. But not today. Today, they had told the truth. And someone had finally listened. The news spread faster than anyone anticipated. By the end of the day, clips from the courtroom had gone viral, headlines burst across local and national outlets, and every radio station in Baltimore buzzed with the same question: how deep did the corruption run, and how had it gone undetected for so long? Keisha Robinson's name wasn't a secret anymore. Her face, once hidden under layers of rags and dirt, was now on every screen, eyes focused and jaw set in the kind of expression that carried weight beyond the title beneath her name. But none of it brought her peace. She hadn't done this for recognition, and certainly not for the spotlight. If anything, the light exposed too much. It reminded her that justice, though achieved for one moment, was still rare. And the battle, far from over. In the aftermath of the arrests, the FBI launched a full-scale investigation into the city's justice system. Files were unsealed. Cases re-examined. Former defendants were called back for interviews. Victims who had once been too afraid to speak began stepping forward, one by one, sharing stories that echoed the same themes: fear, powerlessness, silence. And now, their voices were being heard. But Keisha watched it all with a mixture of resolve and restraint. Because with every truth that surfaced, a new layer of pain was uncovered. The victory in court had cracked the dam, but the flood that followed didn't cleanse, it exposed. And exposure, while necessary, was brutal. Maya Holloway had become a key figure in the task force now building around the investigation. She worked long hours beside Keisha, driven not by duty, but by something personal. They rarely talked about it, but Maya's father had once sat in a cell because of false testimony, the same kind of testimony Kearns had perfected over the years. And now, with every document they pulled and every timeline they reconstructed, Maya was peeling back layers of her own grief, giving it purpose. In one quiet moment, she looked up from a desk littered with case files and said, "I used to think justice was about balance. Righting wrongs. But now I wonder if it's just about slowing down the damage." Keisha didn't answer right away. She sat across from her, sipping cold coffee, watching footage from another trial, the same patterns repeating in different faces. "Maybe it's about refusing to accept the damage as permanent," she said finally. "Maybe justice is just remembering. Refusing to forget." But memory was a double-edged sword. The deeper Keisha went into the files, the harder it became to sleep at night. She had unlocked something vast and systemic, and now she couldn't look away. There were names she recognized in those files. Families she had once tried to help. Boys whose lives had been erased because no one listened. She had to live with the knowledge that even her success came too late for some. And yet, she kept pushing forward, because stopping now would mean accepting that delay as acceptable. One evening, after a long day of reviewing sealed testimonies, Keisha returned home to find an envelope slipped under her door. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with typed words, "What about the ones you missed?" There was no threat. No signature. Just a question. But it sat in her chest like a stone. It reminded her that this fight had no clean end. That even as one system fell, another was rising somewhere else. It made her think of Marcus again. His smile. The way he used to believe in things before the world told him not to. She folded the paper and slid it into her desk drawer. She would deal with that later. The city's mayor requested a private meeting with Keisha the following day. It was framed as a gesture of appreciation, a way to publicly align with her work. But Keisha knew better. Politicians were always trying to ride the wave of change without getting wet. In a sleek conference room overlooking the harbor, the mayor smiled too wide and spoke in rehearsed sound bites. "This city owes you a debt of gratitude. You've reminded us what accountability looks like. I'd like to establish a committee, your committee, focused on law enforcement oversight. Permanent. Funded. Independent." Keisha didn't smile back. She leaned forward. "If you're offering this to look good on paper, save your ink. If you're offering because you know what's coming if we don't change, then we can talk." The mayor hesitated, then nodded slowly. "This isn't about paper. It's about rebuilding trust. Trust doesn't come from committees. It comes from consequences," Keisha said. "We can't rebuild anything until we tear down what's rotting." Later that night, Keisha walked past the courthouse steps. It was empty now. No reporters. No protests. Just stone and silence. She stood there for a long time, remembering the first day she walked in under disguise. Remembering the coins. The laughter. The weight of being seen as nothing. And she thought about how many others still walked those steps with nothing in their hands but fear. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a single quarter, one of the same coins Colton had tossed at her feet. She placed it on the railing, letting it balance there before walking away. A quiet reminder that the story hadn't ended. That there was still more to say. At home, she turned on the news to see a special segment titled, "The Woman Who Brought Down the Wall." It was filled with dramatized narration, bold headlines, and commentary from people who hadn't been in the room. They talked about her like she was a symbol. A storm. But Keisha didn't want to be a storm. Storms pass. She wanted to be something that stayed. Something that rooted change deep enough that it couldn't be swept away with the next administration. But then came the part of the broadcast she didn't expect, a clip from an anonymous source, suggesting that internal FBI communications had flagged Keisha's operation as a potential ethical breach, citing the risk of entrapment and deviation from standard protocol. The segment ended on a question: did she go too far? She turned off the screen. That was the dilemma, wasn't it? When the system is broken, what rules are you allowed to break to fix it? When justice won't listen, how loud are you allowed to scream? She sat in the dark with those questions swirling inside her. This wasn't the ending. This was the consequence. The price of truth. And it was still unfolding. Outside, the city breathed in the early hours of morning. Lights flickered. Sirens wailed in the distance. Somewhere, someone was writing the next story, planning the next move. And Keisha knew the truth: the fight wasn't over. It had just changed shape. But before she faced what came next, there was still something left to do. Something unfinished. Personal. And it waited for her in a place she hadn't returned to in years. It had been nearly 4 years since Keisha had last walked through the gates of St. Elizabeth's Youth Correctional Facility, a low-slung, gray brick complex buried on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by chain-link fences topped with razor wire and a silence that was heavier than the concrete walls. This was where Marcus had been sent. This was where he'd spent his last months alive. She had avoided it like a scar she couldn't bear to touch, a place soaked in memory so dense it felt like it could drown her. But now, standing in front of the weather-worn sign, her hands cold inside her coat pockets, she knew this return wasn't for closure. Closure was a myth. She wasn't here to let go. She was here to remember, to face what the investigation couldn't fix, to stand in the space where the system had swallowed someone she loved and left nothing behind but silence and blame. Inside, nothing had changed. The same dim lighting, the same metallic clatter of doors locking behind her, the same long corridors that echoed with the weight of lives interrupted. She was escorted by a young corrections officer named Jonah, barely older than Marcus had been when he died. He didn't know who she was at first, just that she had clearance and a scheduled meeting. As they walked, he glanced at her several times, as if trying to place her face from somewhere. "You with the FBI, right?" he finally asked, his voice quiet but not disrespectful. She nodded. "They say you were the one who got those cops locked up. The ones who used to bring kids in here like it was a game." Keisha looked at him, studying his face. "It wasn't a game for the kids." Jonah hesitated. "Yeah. I know. I started working here after Marcus died. They said it was an accident, but nobody really believed that. I didn't know him. Just the stories. The quiet kid. Always writing in that notebook. Never caused trouble." Keisha stopped walking. "You remember his notebook?" Jonah nodded. "We used to find little scraps of poetry in the yard. Some of the other boys kept them." Said his words made the place feel less heavy. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't known that. All this time, she thought his voice had been erased along with his record, but it had lingered in ways she never imagined. She followed Jonah through another set of doors until they reached the common room, now empty, the walls covered in murals painted by former detainees. In one corner, a smaller, faded piece of graffiti stood out, just a line scrawled in blue marker, barely legible: "They can't lock up the sky." Keisha turned away quickly, afraid of what might break loose inside her if she stared too long. Jonah gave her space, standing by the exit, letting her be alone. She sat on one of the cold benches, her hands folded tight in her lap, her mind spinning through every moment that had led to this one. The trial. The footage. The revelations. None of it brought Marcus back. None of it filled the space he left behind. But what it had done was prove that his life wasn't a mistake. That his story mattered. That he had been real, and that what happened to him wasn't forgotten. Later, as she left the facility, Jonah handed her a small envelope. "We keep a few things, just in case anyone ever comes back for them," he said. "This was in storage. I figured you'd want it." Inside was a folded piece of lined notebook paper, yellowed with time. On it was a poem, written in Marcus's unmistakable handwriting, the letters pressed hard into the paper like he was trying to make them last. "They say justice is blind, but I think she just closes her eyes when the ones who cry for help don't wear suits and ties, but I keep writing because words remember even when people don't." Keisha pressed the paper to her chest, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself cry. Not just for Marcus, but for every child whose story never made the news, whose file ended in a dusty drawer, whose name was reduced to a number and a sentence. She cried because the world had made it too easy to forget them, and because it was her responsibility now to make sure that never happened again. The next morning, she met Maya at a small cafe just a block from the Bureau's Baltimore field office. They sat at the corner table, away from the noise, sipping black coffee and sorting through folders. The tension between them had settled into a quiet understanding. They didn't talk about the trial. They didn't need to. Everything they'd fought for was now out there in the world, being debated, dissected, politicized. But there was one thing they hadn't discussed. "What if they come for you?" Maya asked finally, her voice low but firm. "After that news segment? The Internal Review Board is sniffing around. They'll say you blurred lines. That you went too far. Used personal grief to justify federal actions." Keisha stirred her coffee slowly. "Let them come. I didn't do this for them, but you put yourself on the line, so did you." Maya leaned back, exhaling hard. "Yeah. But I don't have as far to fall." Keisha looked at her. "Then maybe it's our job to make sure no one has that far to fall ever again." There was silence for a while, filled only by the distant clink of silverware and quiet conversations. Then Maya said something that hit deeper than Keisha expected. "You know, sometimes I wonder if we're just building better cages. Cleaner versions of the same system. Policies and reviews and oversight panels. But the power still answers to itself. We expose one ring of corruption, and another grows in its place." Keisha nodded slowly. "I think about that too. But maybe what we're really doing is planting seeds. The kind that take longer to grow. Maybe the real work isn't in toppling everything at once. Maybe it's in making sure the roots we leave behind don't rot the next generation." Later that afternoon, Keisha stood in front of a room full of new recruits at the Bureau's training academy. She hadn't planned to speak, but they'd requested her. Some of them had been in high school when the trial went viral. They looked at her like she was a legend, a living warning and a promise all at once. She didn't use a script. She didn't talk about tactics or regulations. Instead, she told them about the silence. About what it meant to be ignored. About how sometimes the most dangerous lie is the one you tell yourself when you convince yourself that neutrality is the same as justice. "You will be tested," she said. "Not on whether you can pull a trigger or file a report. But on whether you'll stay quiet when it's easier. Whether you'll look away when the truth makes you uncomfortable. I hope you won't. I hope you remember that every uniform you wear means nothing if the person inside it forgets why they put it on." The room was silent when she finished. Not out of fear, but respect. And maybe, just maybe, hope. That night, Keisha returned home to find another envelope at her door. This time, it wasn't unsigned. It was from one of the boys who had once shared a cell block with Marcus. He'd seen the trial. He'd recognized her. And in his letter, he wrote, "He used to talk about you all the time. Said his aunt was the strongest person he knew. Said if anyone could break this cycle, it'd be you. You did it. You really did." Keisha stood in her living room, the city buzzing softly outside her window, the letter trembling in her hands. The world wasn't fixed. The system was still bruised. But somewhere in that darkness, something had shifted. And she knew, without doubt, that Marcus had been right. The cycle had cracked. Now she just had to make sure it shattered completely. The days that followed moved slowly, like time itself had been bruised by everything that had happened. Keisha returned to work, but everything felt different now. The office was quieter when she walked through, her colleagues watching her with a new kind of gaze, half reverence, half caution. Some saw her as a hero, others as a threat. But she didn't care about their comfort. She had never done this to be liked. The weight of her choices followed her into every meeting, every press inquiry, every stare from across the hall that lingered a second too long. The whispers weren't as loud as before, but they were sharper, more surgical. People who once dismissed her now wanted to quote her. Others who had stood beside her from the start, like Maya, stayed closer, their bond now rooted in something beyond loyalty. It was survival, shared purpose, the kind of connection born in the fire of truth-telling. One afternoon, Keisha met with Internal Affairs. The meeting had been scheduled as a routine debrief, but everyone knew what it really was, a soft attempt to clip her wings. She sat in a stark room with two senior investigators, both of them careful in their language, every sentence laced with diplomatic poison. They asked her about her methods, her decision to go undercover without notifying every level of command, the psychological toll of her personal involvement. She listened, nodded, answered with precision. But when they asked if she regretted the operation, she leaned forward, her voice low and unwavering. "I don't regret uncovering the truth," she said. "I regret that I had to lie to do it. But I did what needed to be done, because the system you're trying to protect was built to look the other way." The older agent furrowed his brow. "You understand the precedent this sets, right? Agents going rogue, justifying personal missions under the banner of justice." Keisha cut him off. "What precedent? That we hold our own accountable? That we don't wait for permission to stop harm when it's happening in front of us? If that's the precedent, then maybe it's one we should have set a long time ago." They didn't argue. They closed their folders, thanked her, and promised to review everything thoroughly. She knew what that meant. Politics. Optics. Containment. They couldn't erase her, but they could try to isolate her, reduce her to a cautionary tale instead of an example. But Keisha had already made peace with that. They could control the narrative, but they couldn't undo what had already been seen. That evening, she met with Andre and his mother at a small restaurant near Druid Hill. It wasn't official. No cameras, no notepads. Just a quiet table in the back and three people trying to find the ground again after surviving a storm. Andre looked different now, still guarded, but with a steadiness that hadn't been there before. His mother smiled through tears when Keisha arrived, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for hers. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice soft but full of depth. "You gave me my son back. You gave him a second chance." Keisha squeezed her hand. "You don't owe me thanks. You deserve what every mother deserves, the truth. Safety. Justice. I just helped pull back the curtain." Andre looked down at his plate, then up again, his eyes wide and searching. "Do they ever really pay for it?" he asked quietly. "The ones who do this. Who walk away like it was nothing." Keisha didn't answer right away. She looked at him carefully. "Some do," she said finally. "Some face charges. Some lose their jobs. But justice isn't always about what happens to them. Sometimes it's about what doesn't happen to you anymore. You're free, Andre. That's a kind of justice too. And now you get to decide who you become with it." He nodded slowly, not satisfied, but starting to understand. They sat there a while longer, talking about the future, college, mentorship programs, therapy. Keisha offered to connect him with a counselor she trusted, someone who specialized in helping young men navigate trauma and rebuild trust in systems that had failed them. His mother wiped her eyes again, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like years. Later that week, Keisha received an invitation to speak at a national law enforcement summit. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same institutions that once rejected her presence now wanted her voice to lend them credibility. She debated turning it down. What was the point in speaking to rooms full of people who clapped in public and undermined progress in private? But Maya encouraged her to go. Be in the room, Maya said. Even if they don't want you there. Especially if they don't. Make them listen. Make it harder for them to pretend they didn't know, so Keisha went. She stood on a stage under glaring lights and looked out at a sea of uniforms, suits, and cameras. She didn't smile. She didn't start with pleasantries. She started with the story. Marcus's story. Andre's story. Her story. And then she asked them the one question no one was ready for. How many more are you willing to lose before you admit this system needs to change? The room didn't move. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others looked away. A few nodded. And that was enough for her. Because change didn't come from applause. It came from discomfort. From confrontation. From people who were willing to carry the weight of being the first to speak when everyone else stayed quiet. In the days that followed, Keisha received hundreds of messages, some hateful, calling her a traitor, a disgrace, an embarrassment to the badge. But others, far more, were messages of thanks. From officers who had buried their guilt. From mothers who saw themselves in her. From young black kids who now believed they might have a shot at justice. The weight of their voices steadied her. Then came the letter. It was delivered by hand, signed by a retired officer whose name she recognized immediately. He had worked in the same precinct as Kearns and Colton. He had never been accused of anything, never been investigated. But in the letter, he confessed to knowing what had been happening all along. To looking the other way. To keeping his head down to protect his pension. I was a coward, he wrote. And I watched good kids get destroyed by a system I was supposed to defend. I can't undo what I didn't do. But I'm ready to help. If you'll let me. Keisha sat with that letter for hours. It wasn't absolution. But it was something. A crack in the silence. She met with him a week later in a small, quiet office. He was older now, slower, but his eyes were clear. He brought files, notes he'd kept, dates, names, things he never submitted because he was too afraid. I should have come forward sooner, he said. You should have, Keisha replied. But you're here now. That counts for something. Together, they began compiling evidence. Cases that had fallen through the cracks. Records that never made it into official databases. A new investigation began, not one built on spectacle, but on persistence. Because that was the work now. Not just breaking what was broken. But rebuilding what had been lost. One truth at a time. Months passed, and with each day, Baltimore slowly started to shift. The city didn't transform overnight, no city ever does, but you could feel the quiet unraveling of an old narrative. There were new voices on city councils, new community-led oversight boards with real teeth, and cases once buried under years of silence were now front and center. The boys who had once been treated like numbers were being seen again as names, as stories, as futures that still had time to bloom. And for Keisha Robinson, that change wasn't just policy, it was personal. Her work had not only exposed an entire web of corruption but had also set a new national precedent. The Department of Justice issued reforms based directly on the findings of her case, and though some in Washington resisted, too many eyes were now watching for them to turn away again. The retired officer who had come forward, Gerald McNally, became one of the most unexpected agents of justice. He joined Keisha's task force, not as a badge-wielding enforcer, but as a voice of redemption. In meetings, he shared what it felt like to carry complicity in silence, to live with the knowledge that he could have done more and didn't. And surprisingly, people listened. Victims' families respected him not because he had once worn the badge, but because he chose to break its unspoken code when it mattered most. Through his cooperation, at least 17 additional cases were reopened, 3 of which led to full exonerations. McNally never asked for forgiveness, and perhaps that's why he earned a measure of it. Maya Holloway, who had walked beside Keisha from the earliest moments of the investigation, was promoted to special agent in charge of a newly formed civil integrity unit. She expanded their reach, taking their mission beyond Baltimore into neighboring districts that had long operated in shadows. Her leadership was fierce, but grounded, and when asked how she kept going, she always answered the same way, because I remember what silence costs. Her story became one of resilience, not just in the face of corruption, but within a system that had tried to bury her own family's truth. Her father's case, once sealed and forgotten, was now being reviewed, and his name was finally cleared. Andre, the boy who had been nearly lost to a lie, found himself in a different kind of spotlight. He enrolled in a local community college with a focus on criminal justice, determined to work toward a future where kids like him weren't defined by false arrests and courtroom whispers. With Keisha's guidance, he began speaking at youth centers, sharing his story with others who had been caught in the system's grip. He never pretended to be healed, never dressed his wounds in false hope, but he spoke with a strength that came from knowing he had survived, and that others could too. As for the officers who had once operated with impunity, Kearns, Colton, and the disgraced Judge Pierce, their names were etched into legal records not as heroes of public safety, but as warnings. Their trials drew massive attention, but not for the drama. What stunned the nation was how quickly their power vanished once truth entered the room. All three were convicted on multiple charges, ranging from obstruction of justice to civil rights violations. In court, not one of them could muster real remorse. Colton stayed defiant until the end, claiming the city would fall apart without men like him. But as he was escorted out of the courtroom in chains, the silence of the public spoke volumes. Power had changed hands. Keisha's own path didn't end in an office behind layers of bureaucracy. She declined multiple offers for promotions that would have pulled her away from fieldwork. Instead, she chose to head a national initiative focused on truth and accountability inside law enforcement. Her face was now familiar to millions, but her mission remained the same, to create systems where people weren't just protected, but heard. She traveled the country, spoke to survivors, walked through neighborhoods that hadn't seen justice in decades. And every time she stood in front of a crowd, she carried Marcus's poem folded in her pocket, the ink faded but the words still loud. She had become the kind of change he once believed in. She had become the storm and the shelter. One evening, she stood in the middle of a newly painted mural in West Baltimore, where young artists had depicted the faces of those lost and those who fought for them. In the center, surrounded by color and light, was a portrait of her holding Marcus's poem. Children ran past her, pointing and smiling. An old woman offered her a blessing as she walked by. And for the first time in a long time, Keisha allowed herself to pause, to breathe in the weight of everything they'd built, not alone, but together. So now, if you're still here, still holding on to this story, let me ask you something. What does justice look like to you? Is it a courtroom victory? A badge stripped from a corrupt hand? Or is it something quieter, a boy getting to go home to his mother, a girl learning that her voice is enough, a system no longer safe for liars in uniform? Because justice isn't a destination. It's a decision. One we make every day, in every room we enter, every truth we choose not to ignore. Keisha's story isn't just about retribution. It's about responsibility. It's about what happens when one person decides that silence is no longer an option, and how that choice can ripple through an entire city. Now I want to hear from you. What part of this story hit you the hardest? What would you have done in Keisha's place? Have you ever felt powerless inside a system that was supposed to protect you? Tell us in the comments. We're listening, because stories like this aren't just to be heard, they're to be shared, questioned, and remembered. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, made you feel, or opened your eyes in a new way, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. There are more stories coming, real, raw, and unforgettable. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and let's keep breaking the silence together. You've heard her truth. Now it's your turn.